Okay, this is basically just a recap of presidential Reconstruction. I mean, by the time it's ending, because once again, President Andrew Johnson really didn't think that the southern states had to do that much, or those who had left the Union had to do that much to get back into the proper relationship with everybody else. It's kind of like, you know, hey, we're all family, we're all brothers, and they're still your brothers, so just let them back in. But of course, this leads many in the South, including Texas, to think that Johnson is like their protector, and they want to try to get things back as soon as possible. So you start having white gangs and outlaws attacking not only Republicans, but also the newly freed men. Indeed, in 1868, there was 509 murders of Republicans, 468 of the newly freed men, and basically the law is just anarchy. Well, this makes the radical Republicans, and once again we call them radicals because not everybody supported them, because their ideas did seem radical. So they were the guys out on the fringe, they'd be like the people like Cortez, Alexandria, stuff that just seems to be on the outside. But when you have, especially there were two bloody race riots, one in Memphis, I forgot where the other one was, that caused a lot of the moderate Republicans to shift and join the radical Republicans. And in the national elections of 1866, the radicals gained control of Congress and thus could carry out their own Reconstruction programs. And one of the first things they did in the first Reconstruction Act, which was of course passed over the president's veto, was it declared inadequate and illegal the existing governments of the southern states. It divided the South into 5 military districts and granted the commanding generals in charge of those different zones authority superior to state law and civil officials. Basically, all these states that had been readmitted to the Union are now kicked back out. And they have to write new state constitutions that grant freedmen the right to vote, as well as a ratification of the 14th Amendment. Now, Philip H. Sheridan was the guy in command over Texas and Louisiana, which was region number 5. He had an interesting story that we'll probably get into a little bit later. Well, what was the 14th Amendment? Well, basically it was based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This act granted citizenship to the newly freed men. Of course, President Johnson vetoed it. Congress, now that they have the numbers, they override his veto, which you can do if you have a 2/3 majority. It includes within it a due process clause that now pretty much stipulated that states or all governments in America, had to follow a due and legal process if they wanted to deprive some of their rights or liberties or property. And finally, it also said that the states within the United States are subject to the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. Well, of course, this gets down to Texas, because Sheridan cannot stand Throckmorton. So on July 30th, Sheridan declared him an impediment to Reconstruction. He removed him and appointed to his stead Governor E.M. Pease. And Pease was a good provisional governor. He'd long time been a resident of the state. He'd already served 4 years as governor prior to the war. He was more flexible than was Throckmorton and moderate in his views. And he was very concerned about the welfare of all his citizens, including the newly freed men, and was prepared to protect their rights. Yet he enjoyed much of the support of the white population and was regarded as a fair and honest guy. So now Congress is going to be in charge of getting the states back in, not the president. And this is where we get to the little personal story of Philip Sheridan, who, like I told you, was the military governor, or the head of Louisiana and Texas. Anyway, there was a race riot in New Orleans where 34 blacks were killed. And when he went out to investigate, he told an aide this wasn't a riot, it was murder. Which made him really clamp down hard on people that were that he saw in rebellion. He passed the Reconstruction Act of March 23rd, where if anybody wanted to vote, they had to take a loyalty oath. And I don't care if you were a mailman for the Confederate government, you know, just a local mailman, you could not vote, even civil officers. Which, needless to say, a lot of Texans felt shocked. Because remember, we're having a total social, economic, political, everything revolution here in Texas, where they're rebuilding everything. Ready? But then Sheridan gets removed because he really butted heads a lot with President Andrew Johnson. Johnson finally has his opportunity, has him removed, and in his stead, he puts in General W.S. Hancock, a guy who had really been heroic during the Battle of Gettysburg, but he was wounded. And he's much more moderate. And he allows the Confederate civil officials to be reinstated. He also reopened the registration of additional voters and prepared for the delegates of a constitutional convention. Because remember, we'd have to write a new state constitution to get back into the Union. Constitutional Convention of 1868. Of the 94 delegates that were in attendance, 10 were black. One was even German born. Not black, but he was a German who had been in the German government. Or actually, this predated German, so it would have been the Prussian government. And among the black representatives was George T. Ruby. That's George T. Ruby right there. George T. Ruby was the head of the Union League, which basically was an organization that helped, not only was it kind of a veteran of foreign wars for old Union soldiers, but more importantly, it was an organization that helped go out and get the newly freed men registered to vote. That was him. Also, you had Matt Gaines, or Matthew. Matthew, you'll see that guy as Matt or Matthew Gaines. And in the people that were delegated to write up our new Constitution, you had 8 to 10 Democrats, which is surprising because it's a radical Republican Congress, and 78 Republicans. And the guy who was in charge of the whole thing was Edmund Jackson Davis, who had worked his way up to a brigadier general. Even though he was born in Florida when he was a baby. His dad, who was a lawyer, moved to St. Augustine, which is over near Nacogdoches. Strong unionist throughout his life. Even fought for the Union. And guys, I will tell you this, if you read any Reconstruction stuff on Texas, he is an incredibly divisive figure, where it's hard sometimes to get through the bias of the writer, because he has not held up to history well in the eyes of some historians. Ready? Now, the first thing that the delegation wanted to do is they wanted to restore constitutional government in East Texas and basically separate West Texas and create a whole brand new state. His reason for doing that is because the pro-union population was high in West Texas, as well as it had a lot of German abolitionists that lived out there. And of course, as you can guess, not too many native-born Texans were too happy about this. And because they spent so much time in talking and deliberation, basically they ran out of money. So they had to pass a new tax in order to pay for the extension of the Constitutional Convention. Once again, not too popular in Texas. And when they come out with the Constitution of 1869, voting rights were given and assured to the newly freed men, as well as to former Confederate civil officers. big, huge step that was taken by this convention was basically what they did for public education. Every time we talked about public education in Texas, it's always seemed to be kind of a pie in the sky idea, but this time, guys, it is more and more to reality. Where they did divide off the land in the counties and towns that would be used for the support of the school. Not only that, it wanted all children from 6 to 18 to be able to attend class. All, black, white, Hispanic. Indeed, there were even some radicals at this convention that said, hey, why don't we give women the right to vote? Which, of course, didn't make it past the cutting room floor. But it's kind of forward thinking. Meanwhile, why don't we get to the state elections? Oh no, we get to the elections for the Constitution. And of course, as you can guess, it's mired in controversy. People say, blacks were prevented the right to vote. Other people say white people, because they were so disgusted by E.J. Davis, Edmund Davis, they refused to vote. But regardless, our Constitution is upheld. And in the national sphere, this is just an interesting side note, the first black U.S. Senator, Hiram Road Rebels, was elected to his position. And then almost prevented from taking his seat in the U.S. Senate. So because the Constitution was upheld, Reconstruction continued for the moment. Everybody got it? Radical Republicans, home rule. Well, when we get to the elections, the radicals, having failed to prevent the completion of the Constitution, go ahead and endorse Davis to govern. And once again, you go through and you have all this stuff of, the intimidation of black voters, which I'm sure happened, and the reaction of white voters. But of the new people that get in, 16 of the 30 senators, state senators, not U.S. senators, 90 members of the House were Davis's men. Meaning that Davis was going to be able to get past whatever he wanted. And one of the first things Governor Davis does is he stated that the Army was not adequately protecting the northern and western frontiers against Native American raids, and stressed the need for legislation providing for a range force for defense. And the legislature immediately approved the raising of a force of 20 companies, more than 1,220 men. He also wanted a state militia system created. So, like the Minutemen of the Revolution, you could have an immediate response to what was perceived as a threat. And he started his own personal police system of 258 men. Then he asked the legislature for the passage of an enabling act. Which basically authorized the governor to fill offices made vacant with his own men, including state, district, county, and city offices. Indeed, he installed more than 8,538 officials that owed their allegiance to him. He also got put in place a state printer, a guy that would print out broadsheets of exactly what the governor wanted to say. Then he announced that other elections were going to be postponed until November 1872. Now guys, why do you think the people of Texas, or some, not all, but why do you think some of the people of Texas may have been horrified by what Davis was doing? What did he do? He increased the army. He has his own personal police force. Who's that army going to be responsible to? Davis. Who's his police force going to be? Davis. He's got his own state printer that's going to be printing out what he wants. And he puts off elections. And guys, Davis is a radical Republican. He is a Republican. And Texas had been Democratic, Democratic, Democratic. And in everything that's going on, and everything that's, because their world is totally ripped apart after the Civil War. They could see this as a tool that could be used to totally strip them away of their rights. Indeed, in the state police force, 40% of the members of that state police force were black. Now, of course, you did have more traditional units, like McNally's Special Force of Texas Rangers, that did operations out in the West against the Native Americans. But guys, basically as governor, Davis passed martial law in like Limestone and Freestone counties after a black police officer was killed. And then later on in Hill and Walker counties. Because of the potential. So once again, guys, as you can see, to a lot of the people that lived in Texas, this seemed like it was their worst nightmare. That basically, this guy was coming in and he's totally changing their world. He's taking king-like dictatorship authority over Texas. Now guys, can you understand why Davis may have done what he did? Why did Davis consolidate all his power like that? Nobody knows. Were most of the people of Texas who had been in the Confederacy, were they happy to be ruled by a Republican in a state that had been largely Democratic since its founding? No. Are they glad to have their world totally turned upside down? No. Davis knows this. Not only that, we've got a huge frontier with the Comanches. A lot of our stuff during the Civil War, we had to use troops basically protecting our frontier against Native American attacks. He knows basically that he's going to have some sense of stability. Well, then the 12th legislature comes into power. This was the Congress. Basically, what they really want to do is bring the railroad to Texas. And they try to do as much as they can do, even though they're a little bit limited as to how they can work with giving away the land to the railroad companies. Because Texas is huge, and they know that we have to get everything connected. Until this time, basically, the little railroads that there were around Houston, not that far into the interior. And they really wanted to bring it up. Also, they established a public road system to further connect us. And public roads are a heck of a lot cheaper than private ones. They passed another homestead law, further protecting you to your rights of property should you have to go through bankruptcy. And during this time, you see a lot of the moderate Republicans that are in our legislature, they're beginning to shift back and kind of align themselves with the Democrats. Because the radicals are getting a little too radical. Then we have the introduction of the 13th legislature that began to repeal, because now that Davis has pretty much lost his majority, they began to repeal the laws that Davis had passed. Like they take away the expense and access to the state printer. So Davis couldn't get out propaganda. They limit the power of the governor to declare martial law. In the governorship, the election breaks down into Richard Koch against Davis. Richard Koch, of course, is a Democrat. Davis is a Republican. And Coke was a Southerner who moved to Texas. And just like always, you have so much of not allowed to vote, didn't vote, like Matt Gaines, the guy who was legislature here in Texas. He also was a member of the Union League who told his black voters that he refused to endorse Davis, claiming that he had not treated the black community fairly. And as you can guess, it was a sweeping victory for Coke. And Davis lost. And Davis refuses to recognize that he's lost. And basically he surrounds the Capitol with his police guard unit. And this is where it gets really messy and icky but anyway, remember guys, most of his police guard unit consisted of the newly freed men. And then to go and make sure that the correct election was done, a group gets up called Travis Rifles. And thankfully shots were prevented. Davis goes ahead and steps down, but he totally refuses to recognize the votes. Now, how many of you guys have ever been to the Texas State Cemetery? At the Texas State Cemetery, the highest statue on the highest hill is a statue to Edmund Davis. Now, like I told you, a lot of Texans did not regard him highly. But what happened was, after Davis died, his brother made sure that he would get buried on that hill. Not only that, but his brother raised the funds to have that huge monolith there. And why did Davis's brother do that? This, of course, is Texas myth and Texas legend. But it used to be not that many buildings in Austin, so every day all the senators and legislatures would go into office, and if they looked over to their left up on a hill, they'd see Davis shooting them the finger with the obelisk. So believe it if you want, don't. Still a good story. But guys, now that Democrat rule is back, basically it's the end of Reconstruction. The other Confederate states got a return to home rule in 1876, but we got it 2 years early. Now, what were the effects of Reconstruction? Well, for years that followed the collapse of the Confederacy, it proved destructive to the wealth of many wealthy plantation owners and difficult for smaller landowners and families that were themselves bankrupted in huge numbers. And you had a lot of people who owned land and people that owned no land but wanted to work it. So you had this new system of labor worked out. At first it was for cash, but then it just came to be a share of the crop, or what we call sharecroppers. And guys, please, whenever you hear of sharecroppers, do not think that every sharecropper was black. My way back was my great-grandfather was a sharecropper in Missouri that basically was able to work his way out, became a county doctor, all that stuff. But it was a difficult economic situation to be in. You had many white voters that carried a seething hatred of Republicans and Republican rule that led to basically Texas was a Democratic state. And it's not until 1970s, late 60s, like we're talking 68, 69, I think it is, though it's not really official until the election of Gill, oh gosh, what's his name? Too many Gills. In 72. And what about the status of the freedmen? Well, huge advances were made, and now that the feds are no longer involved, you start to see a retraction on the freedoms and rights that they have been able to gain. Even though, as always, there would be exceptions. But in the decades to come, segregation, political and economic discrimination, and eventually disenfranchisement would sadly become a way of life for too many of Texas's black citizens.